Got to come up with a few answers. There's no single approach in psychology, but for some psychologists, many of the answers are to be found here, in the biology of the human brain.
The biological approach to psychology is concerned with the influence of brain processes on the way a person thinks and feels and behaves.
The biological approach simply is the idea that all our behaviour emerges from our body, but most of it emerges from the brain. And the biological psychologist is interested in how these behaviours are organised within the brain. And that essentially is what a biological psychologist does.
There's 100 billion components in the human brain, making it the most complex mechanism in the world. But how have psychologists try to find out how it works?
They use mainly animals. They use lesioning, which is damaging brain structure in a variety of ways. They would look at human brain function, but only through accidental brain injury, through strokes or brain damage of other sorts.
One of the famous case studies here is of an American railway worker called Phineas Gage, who was unfortunate enough to have a fairly dramatic accident while working on the railway when an explosive bolt went through his cheek and came out the top of his head. Although he was temporarily immobilised, put on the ground, he was able to get up, pick up the bolt and walk to a hospital. That's what I call hard. The reason this is an interesting story is that what happened to Phineas Gage afterwards, in that he changed his life quite dramatically. No longer was he a compliant worker, but he became, he seemed to change his personality and drank and didn't go to work. Fortunately, things have moved on a bit since Phineas Gage, and we're able to investigate the brain without blowing bolts through people's heads. And you can do it through non-intrusive scanning.
The various scanning machines you find in hospitals now, which can take very detailed pictures of the brains of living people, has totally transformed the area. So now if you want to look at memory, you can actually take a brain scan of someone performing in a memory task.
One of the recent studies was done on taxi drivers. Taxi drivers have to have a number of skills, memories for this, that and the other, but in particular in London they have to have the knowledge, that is a knowledge of the routes around London. And when they're asked to recall the knowledge, a particular route, a certain part of the brain called the hippocampus comes into play. So it seems as if the knowledge of taxi drivers is stored in one little part of their brains.
So perhaps size does matter after all. Taxi drivers' ability to remember vast amounts of information is explained in part by their brain structure. But it isn't just the structure of the brain. Changes in brain chemistry can affect the way we feel and act. Purely in the name of research, these students are testing the effects of chemicals on the brain.
When I've had a few drinks at a weekend, I tend to be a lot more confident than I am now. Also, I'm quite humorous. Tend to do things which I regret in the morning as well.
But our feelings and actions may also be influenced by changes in our hormonal system. For example, an excess of testosterone can cause more aggressive behaviour in men, while many women find their moods changed by their menstrual cycle.
I think people at work might say I'm quite scatty at certain times in the month, and I don't know if that might be attributed towards hormones and things.
Premenstrual tension, PMT, which can bring about severe mood changes, is now recognised as a defence in law. So make sure you get your dates right.
Ultimately, of course, what the biological psychologist wants to do is to have a map of brain function. So you could say that the final goal of all these studies is to build a map of systems within the brain and how behaviour emerges from those systems.
We all know we inherit physical characteristics from our parents, but could our behaviour be inherited too? Oliver's only 4 months old, but is already showing definite personality traits.
He's very calm and laid back. Nothing seems to faze him, so I suppose when he's older he'll just be very relaxed. but his dad's like that anyway, so I suppose you'll follow his dad.
So, is our behaviour all down to genetics?
Look like my mum, act like my dad.
Before, because I was saying, oh, I get this and this off my dad. And I was thinking, well, I've never lived with my dad in my life. And then my mum would turn around and say, you've got such a bad temper, you get that off your dad.
I get very impatient like my dad.
Personality-wise, I'm like my dad. He has the same characteristics as me, as being quiet.
My dad, I take after in the outgoing side, but my mum, I've got a conscience like hers.
Could it be that we come into the world pre-programmed? Is our behaviour determined at birth?
The question of whether our behaviour is determined at birth has been around in psychology since psychology began. It's a controversial question. As we learn more about the way the brain develops, for instance, we know that many of the pathways are genetically laid down. So you're born with a number of pathways that won't change much as you grow.
As research progresses, there are more biological explanations to some of life's major problems.
The more we find out about the brain, the more you might have findings which will be relevant to problems in brain development in children, things like dyslexia and autism. You have recovery from brain damage.
New research has suggested that many behavioural problems may also have a biological basis.
It has been argued that an absence of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, is quite central to understanding anorexia. The absence of serotonin will imply the need to increase serotonin through drug therapy.
In the 1960s, there were very popular models of schizophrenia relating it to family dynamics, experiential problems during adolescence. And then in the 1970s, when brain scanners started to be used, it turned out that in some types of schizophrenia, there was clear brain damage.
So the biological perspective is becoming increasingly important in helping to understand both normal and abnormal behaviour. But surely it can't explain everything. What about its limitations?
The limitations are that it is a deterministic approach, that it suggests that this is a finite set of parameters and you're not going to change over your life.
It's quite clear that any behaviour is going to involve not just your biology, but also the world around you and the people you interact with and the school you go to, the experiences you have.
So Oliver's life can't be reduced to his biology. What about the things that will happen to him, especially in early childhood? And it was this question that inspired the most famous psychologist of all, Sigmund Freud.